All right, my name is Brandon Clayton, the Algebra Guy. Thanks for tuning in. Today we'll be discussing simplifying expressions that have absolute value. So up to this point, we've talked about integers, we've talked about absolute value and the opposites. So let's kind of put it all together now. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to do problems like this. 24 minus the absolute value of 19 minus 3 times 6 minus 2. So let's get right into it. All right, today we will answer these following questions. What is absolute value? How can I simplify and evaluate expressions with absolute value? And how to translate word phrases into integers. So let's look at this one piece at a time. We'll start with the obvious. What is absolute value? So just kind of a brief definition here. Absolute value of a number is the distance from zero on the number line. So if we're not looking at negative numbers anymore, we just want to know about distance. And we never measure distance as negative. So the absolute value of a number n, so let's call some random number, 5, 6, 7, we'll just call it n, is written as absolute value n. So with these two little brackets around it. And the absolute value of n, whatever that value is always going to be greater than or equal to 0 for all numbers. Of course, we're going to do some examples so you can see what that looks like. So in this case, actually, let me back up a little bit. So if I have a number line, I got 0 here and I got numbers, one on there. It's always going to measure how far from 0 it is. So whether that number is 3, so how far is 3 away from 0? Well, that's 3 units. So this is just going to equal 3 because it's 3 units away from 0. So we're only counting how far away, 1, 2, 3, how far away from 0 this actually is. Well, negative 44 would be somewhere about right here, negative 44. And we want to know how far away from 0 that is. Well, you will never talk about distance as negative. So when you go from work or school or whatever it is, no one ever says I'm going negative 5 miles home because I got to go back home. We don't say that. We simply say I'm going 5 miles home. So since distance is measured only in positive, absolute value allows us to see numbers in the positive. So this is 44 units away from 0. And that's one of the main uses of absolute value is when you're trying to calculate distance. You're not concerned about negatives at this point. You just want to know how far from the 0 is, the starting point. So, of course, 0, how far from 0 is 0? Well, that's just 0. All right, so let's continue with this by evaluating the following problems. What if you have this problem here, the absolute value of x, when x is negative 35. So we're going to keep everything the way it is, but in for x, we're going to put x is equal to negative 35, so we're going to put negative 35 here. And now they're just asking us what's the value of that. So we're kind of combining discussions we've had already about how to evaluate, and we're substituting our negative 35 in for x. And we've already just talked about negative 35. The absolute value of negative 35 is simply asking how far is negative 35 from 0. And we're going to say it's 35 units away from 0. We're not going to say distance of negative 35. All right, what about this one? Y equals negative 20. So we have the absolute value of negative y, absolute value of negative, well, we already have it negative. Let me make sure I leave enough room. Negative y. So what is y? Y is negative 20. So I'm careful with this. I'm going to leave this negative sign here, but then I got to replace y here. So that's going to be negative 20. So we've learned what about opposites. So if you have negative 20 and this on the outside is asking what's the opposite of negative 20, well, we know that's going to be the absolute value of 20. And we can simplify this even further by answering what is the absolute value of 20. Well, the absolute value of 20 is simply asking us how many units from 0 is 20, and the answer is 20. Continuing on, what about this one here? If u is 12, we're going to rewrite this one to say, instead of u, we're going to put it 12 here. And that's going to give us Well, what is the absolute value of 12? The absolute value of 12 is just 12 because it's 12 units. So this is going to equal negative 12 because that negative now is going to attach to that 12 when it comes out of the absolute value brackets. All right, same thing here. This is negative the absolute value of p. Well, what is p? Let's replace negative 14 in place of where that p is, and we get negative 14 here. And what does that equal? Well, let's start with the absolute value first. Absolute value of negative 14 is 14. You know what? I should have just, doesn't need brackets anymore because we just found that out. So we're going to keep this negative here because here's the negative on the outside. We're going to just put that right there. And what's the absolute value of negative 14? That's just 14. So that just has a 14 left over. So negative 14 is our answer here. All right, now let's combine again what we've talked about with inequalities, less than, greater than, or equal to for each of the following pieces. So first we have to find out what is the value of each side, and then we need to find the inequality that matches. So the absolute value of negative 5 is just 5 units away from the 0. I gotta get my color out. So this is actually just going to be 5. And we're going to leave that line there. And again, this is 5. So it's going to be negative 5 here. And if you recall our discussion, we know that our negative 5 is back here. Here's a 0. Here's a 5. So which one is further to the right is the larger value, and that's 5. And the mouth is always going to open to the larger value. So it should be written this way. 5 is greater than negative 5. Now that is a little bit confusing because this line under here makes it look like it's equal to. So I'm going to make sure I erase that so there's no confusion. All right, we got 8. That's nothing needs to be done in that one. Absolute value of negative 8 is just 8, so that leaves me with negative 8 here. So what's the inequality we should put? Well, we know that 8 is bigger than negative 8, so there's our inequality there. All right, next one is this negative 9. You should pause this and try to work this one yourself and see what you would put. Work these two. Absolute value of negative 9 is 9, so this ends up being negative 9 because that negative is on the outside, and this part right here is going to be 9. So negative 9 and negative 9. Well, this is going to be equal to, right? All right, so let's do this one. The absolute value of negative 7 is just 7. Well, this negative on the outside, I have to put to it after I do that absolute value. And negative 7 is just negative 7. And like the left side, these are both equal. So that's how we're going to do that one. All right, let's do A and B here. Same thing, but this time it's not going to be fill in. I wrote this wrong. We're just going to evaluate this. So what is absolute value of 9 minus 3? Well, just like we did with PEMDAS, remember PEMDAS, we always did our brackets first. We always did this P, the parentheses or any kind of grouping. So we're going to treat the absolute value this way. So since 9 minus 3 is inside of that, we're going to take that 9 minus 3 and say that must be 9 minus 3 is 6. So absolute value of 6. The absolute value of 6 equals 6 because it's 6 units away. Again, let's start with our grouping here. And we have 4 times, because it's right next to the 2. There's no plus, minus, or division here. This is times. A little times. I'll put a dot there just to make sure you see it. Well, what's the absolute value of negative 2? Well, that is 2. And put a little parentheses, 2. So now this is multiplying. 4 times 2 is 8. Be careful not to make the mistake of thinking I'm just going to say 4 times negative 2 is negative 8. And so don't make that mistake. And don't try to do 4 times 2 is negative 8, then say absolute value of that, because this is not what that's saying. You need to do your grouping first. It didn't matter on this problem, you get the same answer, but it will matter later when the problems get a little bit more sophisticated. All right, so simplify this. We're going to do the inside of this absolute value first. So here's my absolute value signs. 8 plus 7 is 15 minus the absolute value of 5 plus 6, which is 11. Well, what is the absolute value of 15? That's just 15 because it's 15 units away. Minus, what's the absolute value? Absolute value. 15 is 15. Absolute value of 11 is 11. What is 15 minus 11? That equals 4. Oh my, look at that one. I believe we started off talking about this problem. So just like PEMDAS, we're going to start with our inmost grouping symbols, which is right here. We're going to start with these. This is the most inside. So this 6 minus 2 gives me a 4. And I'm going to rewrite everything. 24 minus absolute value 19 minus 3 times 4. So this is all in the absolute value. Now I'm still working inside this absolute value before I take the absolute value. So what's the next piece I need to do? Well, according to PEMDAS, I need to do my multiplying and dividing before I do adding and subtraction. So this is multiplying right here, this 3 and a 4. So let's do it. 24 minus absolute value. We got 19. What's negative 3 times 4? That's going to be a negative 12. And now we're simplifying it even more. We got one more step to get out of this grouping symbol, this absolute value here. 19 minus 12, 24 minus the absolute value of 19 minus 12 is 7. And now 24, what is the absolute value of 7? That's just 7. So what's 24 minus 7? I think that's 17. Yep. That's going to equal 17. So all of that equals 17. All right, now how do you translate these word phrases into expressions with integers? Because now we're talking about integers, which are positive numbers, the negative numbers, and 0. So one of the ways you need to do that in talking about these negative signs, look for words that indicate a negative sign. Like, for example, the word negative is a good indication that you're going to need a negative sign. Negative in negative 20 indicates you're going to have a negative 20. So does the word opposite in the word opposite of 20. Well, what's the opposite of 20? You hear words like that or phrases. You need to know how to translate those into an expression or equation, which we'll likely do later. So let's practice a little bit on that. How do I write this one as a phrase? The opposite of positive 14. Translate each phrase into an expression. Sorry. So we're going from this phrase into an expression. So how do I get this into an expression? The opposite, well, that means the opposite is we're going to, opposite of a positive 14. And that's it right there. That's the opposite of a positive 14. Okay, thank you. And another problem, let's try this one. The opposite of negative 11. The opposite of a negative 11. Notice I put parentheses to show that I want this whole negative 11 to be opposite. So what's the opposite of a negative 11? Well, that's a positive 11 because we had that discussion before. We even talked about how negative times a negative is a positive since these are right next to each other as in multiplication. All right, continuing with some practice. Let's do these two. What about negative 16? Well, that should be easy, right? Negative 16. 2 minus negative 7. 2 minus negative 7. You got to be careful of those two negative signs. Notice I always put parentheses there. So the opposite of a negative 7 is going to turn into a positive 7. So that's going to give me 9 if they asked me to solve it. But they didn't. They just want me to rewrite it. All right, let's continue making these expressions. This is a little bit more real world. The temperature is 12 degrees Fahrenheit below 0. And there's that key word, right? Below 0. So it's 12 degrees below 0. So it's going to make that negative. And the football team had a gain of 3 yards. So if you're gaining 3 yards, it's simply going to be 3. So, and you can even say plus 3 for that gain. All right, let's look at another 2. The elevation of the Dead Sea is 1,302 feet below sea level. Now, it's kind of deceiving when you hear elevation because that means to go up or to elevate something. But then you realize that it's below zero. So this is going to be 1,302 feet below zero. The checking account is overdrawn. Wow. You might not know that word, but hopefully you'll never find out from your own experience. Overdrawn means you took out too much money, so now this is going to be a minus 40. So because you overdrew $40. All right, so did we accomplish our goal? What is the value, absolute value? We talked about that. We talked about the notation for absolute value, which are those brackets. How can I simplify and evaluate expression with absolute value? Start with the inmost brackets, what we talked about. You just, if you got -6 here, it's always going to be a positive number. And you start with everything on the inside there. How do I translate word phrasing to expressions with integers? And we just did that. Just take note of the negative words that you tend to see. -17, opposite to, gain, overdrawn. Be sensitive to those positive and negative words, and you'll be good. I'm Brandon Clayton, the Algebra Guy, and thank you again for tuning in. Until next lesson, I'll talk to you later.